And I'm Mary Sia. Welcome to our Southwest Wings online speaker series.
Today, I'm especially pleased to be able to welcome Jeff Babson, who many of you will know as a tour guide for the field trips which Southwest Wings runs at its festivals. Jeff is an experienced naturalist and educator and also runs an eco tour company. Today, he'll be talking to us about the magical and mysterious world of moths. Now, if you have any questions for Jeff, please keep these to the end and use the question and answer feature, which you'll find within Zoom. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to the magical and some would say mysterious Jeff Babson.
Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, Chris and Mary. That was very nice. I don't know how mysterious I am, but thank you very much for having me. I think it's a brilliant idea to do this online speaker series in a form of replacement for actually doing the festival itself. So I applaud you both for that. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're going to go on a very brief tour of Moths. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and hopefully this will work. Close that. Come over here. And we're off and running. So again, this is a talk about moths. They're actually gaining in appreciation as watchable wildlife. They have a long way to go to catch up to things like birds and butterflies and dragonflies, but there's a lot of people getting more and more interested in moths. And we were very excited, Chris and I, this year to have a blacklight night planned as a field trip for both the Spring Fling and the main festival, but then we all know what happened after that. But we hope to do that whenever we can start to do field trips again. We will definitely look to incorporate a moth outing into that. So this little guy here on the title side, this is a tiger moth. Tiger moths are sort of I guess if you were a birder, you could equate them to sort of like the warblers or the tanagers of the moth world. They're often very brightly colored and people kind of are drawn to them. So I think we should first start off with what a moth actually is. And a moth, just so we're all on the same page. So a moth is a member of the insect order Lepidoptera. The entomologists, who are the biologists who study insects, divide all the world's insects into about 30 or 32 different groups called orders, and the butterflies and moths are linked together in the order Lepidoptera. One of the things that they share several characteristics, one of which is the fact that their colors and patterns are produced by scales, tiny microscopic scales that lay on the wing membrane, somewhat like shingles on a roof. And so, you know, if you ever find a dead moth in the windowsill and you pick it up and you toss it outside and there's that sort of dust-like stuff on your fingertips, those are the scales that come off of the wings. And it's believed that one of the reasons for the evolution of the scales in the first place was to allow moths to escape from spider webs. They could leave some scales behind, but the insect itself would be able to fly away. The scales have nothing to do with flight. In fact, there's not many, but quite a few moths and some butterflies that don't really have any scales on the wings, and they fly just fine. Another thing that they all share is they undergo what's called complete metamorphosis, which means there are 4 distinct stages in the life cycle: the egg, the larva, which are called caterpillars, the pupa, and the adult. And when I was in school, I was told that the pupa was the resting stage. That is not true. The larva is basically a walking stomach. They have 2 jobs. They're trying to eat as much as they can, as quickly as they can, while at the same time not get eaten by something else, like a bird or a lizard. And then they'll grow, they'll go through several molts, and then they'll get big enough, and then they'll form the pupa. And the pupa, like I said, we were taught that it was a resting stage. Apparently all those caterpillars are so tired after eating all that food, they needed to take a break. That is not what's going on. Couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, what's happening in the pupal stage is that the caterpillar's body is basically getting sort of digested and reorganized into the adult. And so basically in these insects that have complete metamorphosis, which also includes things like beetles, true flies, bees, wasps, and ants, there's some others, those are the main groups. They're basically two different animals. The larval stage and the adult stage are basically two different animals feeding on completely different foods, and in the same time not competing with each other. So that's a pretty neat trick that these insects have been able to come up with. They also have sucking mouth parts as adults for taking in liquid food. So everyone knows that butterflies and moths take in nectar. They'll also go to rotting fruit, for example. They'll go to carcasses sometimes. They'll go to tree sap flows out of trees, like where there's a wound in a tree. But the adult moths and butterflies all take in liquid food, except for some that don't really have mouth parts, and they can't feed even if they wanted to. So their adult stage is quite short. And as everyone knows, most moths are nocturnal. The most is the key part of that, because there are quite a few moths that also fly during the daytime. So, but the majority of them come out at night. So here's an example of one. This is the same family actually as that title slide. This is another tiger moth. They get their name because of these bands on the wings, sort of pale yellow or cream, sometimes orange or pink or red, depending on the species. And then they cover up these red hind wings and the red and black body. These moths are really fascinating, actually. The tiger moths is a group, not just this species in specific, but they're actually toxic and to predators, and that's what they're warning. This warning coloration is basically showing a lizard or a bird that might find them during the daytime that they don't want to eat them, but they also do the same thing at night. They can actually make signals, make sounds that sort of jam the sonar of bats, and so they're able to dive out of the way of an oncoming bat. So it's pretty interesting stuff that these insects are able to accomplish. So one of the questions I'm asked all the time is, how do you tell the difference between a moth or a butterfly? And you can't really use moths come out at night and butterflies come out during the daytime. It is certainly the case that nearly all butterflies are active during the daytime, but there are plenty of moths that are active at night, during the day as well. So that doesn't really work. And sometimes I hear people say, well, that's brightly colored, it must be a butterfly. Well, there are some absolutely gorgeous moths and some relatively drab butterflies, and so that doesn't work either. So the best way, I think, is to look at the antenna. And so the antenna are these little things sticking out of the head. And in most insects, they're basically scent receptors, so they act sort of like our noses. And so if it looks like a feather, like on this case, this is another tiger moth actually. If it looks like a feather, or you can see right here, they insert by the eye and they kind of go back over the head. So these look like a thread. If they look like a thread or a feather, you're looking at a moth. If they look sort of like a Q-tip or a Q-tip with a little hook on it, you're looking at a butterfly. So that is the single best way to distinguish the two. Generally speaking, moths have more stout bodies for their size compared to an equally sized butterfly. But there are some butterflies, like skippers, for example, tend to be relatively robust bodied. And some moths, like inchworm moths, tend to be fairly slim bodied for a moth. So that's why I say the antenna is the best place to start. Just look at those antennae. If it's a feather-like or a thread-like, you're looking at a moth. If it looks like a Q-tip, and it's basically the Q-tip comes from this structure right here, which is called the club. And sometimes the club has a little hook on it. If you see this, you're looking at a butterfly. So that's the best way to tell them apart. Again, the moth life cycle, we talked about this briefly before, but there's 4 distinct stages. The egg stage starts everything off. The eggs are little packets of potential. That's their really their only sort of job. And they often are laid on or very close to the food source, meaning what the caterpillars will eat. And they're in different species, different families lay their eggs in different manners. Some lay them singly one per plant or one per leaf. Some lay them in small groups, maybe a half dozen or so. Some lay them in bigger groups, maybe up to 100 or 2. It all depends on the species of moth and what their natural history dictates. If you ever, then you get the caterpillar, which we call the larva, which we call a caterpillar. So all insects have a larval stage, meaning they're not able to mate yet. They're not reproductively mature. But only moths and butterflies have larvae that we call caterpillars. So this is the growth stage. Like I said earlier, they're basically walking stomachs. Their main job is to eat as much as they can, as quickly as they can, and not get eaten by something else in the process. Most caterpillars feed on foliage, so leaves of everything from grasses to herbs to forbs to shrubs to trees. There are some caterpillars that actually live underwater and feed on underwater plants. There are some caterpillars that feed on fungus. There are some caterpillars that feed on things like woolens. The clothes moths are an example of that, which usually makes them run afoul of us because we generally don't want our wool sweaters to get eaten. There are some that feed on things like dried food products. So there's a couple of caterpillars that might be pantry pests. So basically, the short answer for what do caterpillars eat is they'll eat just about anything, but they tend to be fairly specific as to what any particular species will eat. As I said, they go through several stages of molting, and basically, like all arthropods, they wear their skeleton on the outside. So as they're eating and getting bigger, it gets a little bit snug in there, and so they have to molt or shed their exoskeleton to allow for future growth. And from the time they hatch from the egg until they become a pupa, most species do that 4 or 5 times. So they go through 4 or 5 molts, getting bigger each time they go. They can also look dramatically different in some cases from one molt to another. The stages between the molts are called instars. So most of them will have 4 or 5 instars, and then they'll pupate. And like I said, they can look dramatically different from one instar to the next. And most of the books that look at caterpillars tend to focus on the final instar, which is the biggest one. It's the easiest one to find. It's also the one right before they become a pupa. And so sometimes the earlier stages, no one knows what they look like because they're hard to find, or people just haven't taken the time to look for them, or they don't know what the food plan is. There's a lot of moths we have no idea what their caterpillars eat, even in the US and in Europe. So there's a lot still to be learned about these insects. So assuming everything goes well and they've eaten a lot and they've grown, they're ready to become a pupa, and that's that transitional stage between the caterpillar and the adult. In some moths, like the wild silk moths, they'll often wrap their pupa in a silken cocoon. Not all moths by any stretch do that, but if you see a silken cocoon, you can be pretty darn positive it's not a butterfly. Butterflies tend to have what are called naked pupa, so that chrysalis that hangs down. And I'll give you an example of what a naked pupa and a cocoon look like, in case you've never seen them before. The pupal stage is hard to find. It's the hardest stage to find besides the egg stage, and the egg stage is just hard because the eggs are small. The pupa is difficult because most pupa can't defend themselves. It's not like they can, crawl away or fly away or do something like that. So they tend to be hidden. They tend to be well camouflaged. Sometimes they're in the soil. Sometimes they're in the leaf litter. But it's a difficult stage in the life cycle to find. And if you want to get proof of that, you can turn your patio light on any night. You know, you can do it tonight if you want, and then go out there in the evening and see how many moths show up, and then know that each one of those went through the pupal stage and how many pupae have you actually found in your yard. And unless you're really looking for them, that number is probably going to be quite small. And so then they become an adult. They go through that miraculous transitional stage and they emerge and they're adults. And the adults basically have two jobs as well. Number one is maybe disperse to new habitats, but their most important job is reproduction. Their job is to find a member of the opposite sex and create the next generation of their species. If you see a small moth, it's not a baby. Remember, the baby is the caterpillar stage. If you see a small moth, it's just a small moth. It's never going to get any bigger than it is, because the caterpillar is the growth stage. So there's a lot of, you know, huge size variation amongst all the moths in the world. But just bear in mind, a small moth, if an adult, it's got the wings on it, then it's just a small moth. It's not a baby. All right. So this is the basic life cycle of one of the sphinx moths. You got the egg stage up here. Sometimes they'll lay, you know, eggs in groups. And then usually within about a week, sometimes a little bit shorter than that, sometimes much longer than that. Again, it depends on the species. The egg will hatch and you get your first instar caterpillar, right? Really tiny little thing. Now it'll start to eat immediately. A lot of times the first meal of the first instar larva is the eggshell. It's got some nutrients in there they can take advantage of. So first thing to do is after they emerge, they might start chomping on the eggshell. Then they find whatever it is they're going to feed on, whether it's foliage or fungus, whatever the case may be. Remember, there's a lot of variation in that. They grow, and then they go through these, you know, as they get bigger, they molt. There's a second instar with the molt in between, third instar, molt in between down here, and so on and so forth. And then you get to become the pupa. Now, this is a naked pupa, which is what like a lot of butterflies look like. Sphinx moths are usually distinctive because this is their mouth part. This is their tongue, quote unquote tongue or proboscis hanging down. And some sphinx moths, although not all of them, you can recognize them because they have this, the proboscis is separate from the rest of the body. It's almost like a little handle on the rest of the pupae. And these guys pupate in the soil. They'll dig down a little bit and they orient themselves so the head's pointing upward. And then again, if everything goes well, then they'll emerge as the adult, and then they'll find the opposite sex, and the cycle starts all over again. Most adult moths tend to live about a month, about 4 weeks, and that's if they're lucky enough not to get eaten by something. That's if they just die of old age. Many moths don't make it from the egg stage to the adult stage because they've been eaten by, you know, mammals, other arthropods, birds, all kinds of stuff is out there eating them. And so, so that's the basic lifestyle. Remember, I haven't told you how many species of moth are out there yet, but when we get there, just remember there's that many variations on this very basic plant. So here's a caterpillar. This is a caterpillar. This is actually, you might recognize, this is the little cup that the prickly pear fruit sit in. And this is the caterpillar that was feeding on the prickly pear fruit. And you can see he was a little bit startled because some excrement came out. And by the way, a polite word for caterpillar excrement is frass, F-R-A-S-S. So you can say I scared the frass out of him. And anyway, so this guy, again, this is a typical caterpillar for this family. They're not very big, maybe half an inch. No, not even that, probably not even that big. 3/4, no, half an inch maybe. And then, but they're feeding on fruit. They're not feeding on the succulent stems. They're feeding on the fruit, the pulp of the prickly pear fruit. So if you like to make prickly pear jam, just be aware you might get a little extra protein, which is okay. It's fine. Here's the big silk moth caterpillars. This was up in Garden Canyon in the Huachucas. And so this, to give you a frame of reference, this thing was about 4 inches long from the heads up here and the tail ends down here. These are, you can't really see the head because it's kind of tucked into this first thoracic segment. So again, just real briefly, the insect has 3 body parts: head, thorax, and abdomen. The head's partly hidden right here. This is the thorax right here. These are the thoracic legs. And then caterpillars have these sort of fleshy appendages, and one usually down at the rear of the body. These are called prolegs. There is no equivalent to these in the adults. Well, there is an equivalent to these in the adults. So you could put if you were so inclined, you could put this guy in a hot dog bun and he would fit comfortably. Hubbard's small silk moth. Now this guy's pretty big compared to that prickly pear feeding one. These guys get to be maybe 2 3/4 to 3 inches, but they feed on mesquite. So you can go out and a really good time to find caterpillars actually is to go out at night because there's fewer predators then. And you can use a flashlight because these little appendages here that look kind of whitish are actually, they'll glow silver in your flashlight beam. And so they're really easy to find. And then a fun thing to do is to go out the next morning and see if you can try to find the caterpillar again without a flashlight. Because they're, even though it looks like in this photo they'd be as plain as day, they're actually remarkably well camouflaged. And I'll show you what the adult of this will turn into here in a little bit. This is an interesting caterpillar. I like to point out to people that some caterpillars can sting. And until you know, if you see a caterpillar that looks like it means business, you may not want to touch it because it might be one of the stinging type. Once you identify it and you find out it's not one of the stinging types, then you can touch them if you want. This one will actually sting you because it's got all these little sort of projections that look kind of like gumdrops. It's got these spines, and the spines are connected to venom glands. And so if you were to brush up against it, if you were to brush up against it, it would give a burning sting. It's not, I mean, it's more of an annoyance to me than anything else, but and there are a handful of species in southern Arizona that will sting you if you brush up against them. And to show you how much still remains to be learned about these animals is this this was taken on a hackberry in my backyard, and this proved to be a new host plant record for this species. So you can find, I mean, it's not an exaggeration at all to say you can make new discoveries in your own yard, for crying out loud, when it comes to moths. So, and this is that big caterpillar I said from Ramsey Canyon, or Garden Canyon. That will turn, this is what its pupae look like. Now, the pupae, this isn't the pupae. You're looking at the silken cocoon. The pupae is actually inside of that. And when the reorganization happens, they'll sort of work their way out, and then they'll become the adults that'll fly around. So this is what your typical cocoon looks like. Those wild silk moths, the Saturniids, are sort of famous for making these sorts of cocoons. Other moths will do it as well. The silkworm, silk comes from a caterpillar of a moth. It's not in this exact family, but a very closely related family. And so we actually, you know, despite all of the, you know, the few that are pests, we actually, one of our fabrics comes from moths, and actually they're caterpillars. And so this is a white-lined sphinx moth caterpillar. This is a pupa. This is, again, as a naked pupa. Here you can start to see some of the body parts. So this is the abdomen down here. And here you can see where the wings are going to be. And then here, right down the middle, that's the tongue. Now this one that I showed in that other slide that showed the life cycle, that particular species has the little, the proboscis separated from the body. This species does not. So that it's sort of pressed up against the underside of the body. Here are going to be the eyes. And so, and as they get closer to emergence, oftentimes the pupa will turn almost clear, right, but like the day or so before the adult's going to emerge, and you can actually see the adult inside the pupal case, and then it will emerge, and then it goes on to find its mates and create the next generation of its kind. So there are a lot of moths out there. So worldwide, estimates range from 160,000 to 180,000 described species. That means someone has formally looked very closely at it and written up a sort of very detailed description of that thing. And then if other scientists will look at it, and if they agree it's a new species, it joins the roster of accepted species. The number, whatever that number is, is way under the total number that are out there, because so many of them still need to be formally described to science. So even if you deal with a high number of 180,000 species worldwide, know that the true number could be in the 300, 400,000 species range. There are 13,000 species in North America in the order Lepidoptera. 94% of them are moths. That's a lot of moths. And just in the western half of North America, there's roughly 8,000 species. Southern Arizona has 2,000. 2,000 species of moth, at least in basically Santa Cruz, Cochise, Pima, and then southern Graham and southern Greenlee counties. 2,000 species. That's a lot of species. And it's been traditional to divide the order Lepidoptera into the micro Lepidoptera or micros, and then the macro Lepidoptera or macros. And even though it's obviously based on size, it's more accurately based on their evolutionary lineages. And basically the micros are more ancient or more basal or more primitive, depending on which word you want to use there. And the macros are more recent or more advanced. So here's this slide, by the way. When we do the quiz at the end of the presentation, I don't think Chris mentioned there was going to be a quiz. One of the questions is you have to recreate this diagram and spelling counts. So study it closely. There's lots of words that mean nothing to anybody, I'm sure. But basically, this is the ancestor to all Lepidoptera. So the more primitive or more ancient lineage is at the top, and the more advanced ones are down here at the bottom. To give you a point of reference, here are the butterflies. This, let me get my cursor back. This group right here, that's the butterflies. Notice there's moths here and moths here. So I think it's very accurate to consider butterflies to be essentially day-flying moths that have a little bit different antenna, maybe a little different body sort of shape, but they're not a special. We treat them as a special group from an evolutionary standpoint. They are really nested within the moths, and so it'd be accurate to call them moths. So the thickness of the bars here indicate how many species are involved. The thicker the bar, the thicker the number of species. And so this group down here is a real big group. In North America alone, I think there's over 3,000 species just in this little group. To make this, if you look at this diagram long enough, you just get a headache. So I've kind of gone to another one. So this is basically the same thing. It took out some of the smaller, branches of the family tree. But what we have here, the blue are the butterflies right here. These are all the butterflies, but we have the same situation. Moths above it and moths below it. So, and remember that in North America, if you see an insect fly by and it's got scales on the wings, you have a 94% chance of being correct if you call it a moth. If you called a butterfly, I wouldn't take those odds. I'm not a betting man, but I wouldn't take those odds. So we're going to go through some of these quickly. We're going to start off with some of the micros, which again are the more advanced. They've been around longer. And many of the micros are indeed quite small. When I mean small, they may be anywhere from 2 to say 6 or 7 millimeters. Some micros are actually quite large. Actually, there are micros that are bigger than the macros, and that's why I say that that using the size, even though it's kind of useful in a general sense, there are a lot of exceptions to that as well. And so that's why I kind of like the more ancient versus the more recent division. I think that's a little bit more accurate. So the yucca moth, this is a female inside of a yucca flower. This is a banana yucca, all that white's inside the flower. So yuccas and yucca moths have very, very special relationships. And by that I mean the only pollinator of a yucca is a yucca moth. And the only thing yucca moth caterpillars will feed on is yuccas. So this is the all your eggs in one basket approach. And so the female, the males will come to light sometimes. The females don't. the best way to find the females is to look inside the yucca flowers when they're flowering. So what she does is she has a special sort of appendages and on her head, kind of the parts of the mouth parts. And what she does is she uses those to sort of make a ball of pollen. And then she flies to another plant. And she goes in a flower on that plant. She kind of slam dunks that ball of pollen on the stigma of that other plant. Now, the stigma is part of the female reproductive structures of flowers. It's basically the pollen receptacle. And so now the yucca plants are happy because they've been pollinated. The yucca moth does this not out of the kindness of her heart. She does it because she's then going to lay an egg in that ovary of the flower, because that's her larvae, her caterpillars feed on the developing seeds. So the yucca plant benefits by getting pollinated, and in return, they provide some food for their pollinators. So it's called it's a mutualism. Both parties benefit from that. So the problem with that is with the all your eggs in one basket approach is if one of them declines, then there's going to very likely be a decline in the other as well, because they're so closely tied together. And to give you this thing was about 1/2 inch long. Plume moths are members of the Pterophoridae, and they kind of look like, they're very easy to recognize. They look like a letter T. And they actually, most insects, most moths included, have 2 pairs of wings on each side of the body, four wings and hind wings. The plume moths have that as well. It's just that when they at rest, they sort of scrunch the wings all together, so it only looks like there's 1 wing on each side. And they also have these long, spindly legs with these big spines on them. Easy to recognize as a family, but can be quite difficult to identify as species. So if you're a birder, these are sort of like, these might be a little bit like gulls, in that the gulls that don't make any sound, so you can't use the vocalizations to help you. You kind of have to look very closely under a microscope at details of either the veins on the wings or the structure of the genitalia to tell them apart. And this is a group that even experts sometimes have a hard time telling apart. At the species level, at the family level, they're quite easy to recognize. The mesquite stinger moth, this is another moth, obviously, that can sting. It's not the moth that can sting, it's the caterpillars that can sting. And this family is very closely related to that family I showed you earlier, that Limacodidae, the slug caterpillar moths. Both of them have members that can sting. Now, this is typically a quite common moth in our area. It feeds on mesquite. It probably also feeds on things like acacias and perhaps palo verdes and ironwood, those sort of leguminous desert trees. But this year was not very good for them, and I think it's because of how dry it was. This year, I was telling Chris last week, actually, that this year was, it would have been a little bit disappointing, I think, to actually set a blacklight up for a field trip, because the overall dryness was such that moth numbers were not great this year. There'll always be some things that show up, but it was down from what I was hoping for. And one of the sort of tricks that moths have up their sleeve is if the conditions aren't right for them to emerge, and they're somehow able to sense that. We're not exactly sure how they're able to do it. So if it's too dry, for example, or too wet even, they can delay emergence for a year or multiple years until conditions are better. And usually a single female will lay anywhere from a few dozen to maybe a couple hundred, even up to a couple thousand eggs. And some of them will probably emerge every year, those that don't get eaten before they have the chance to. But they're sort of, it's the bet hedging strategy. They don't all emerge at once in case the conditions aren't very good, there's no food, and then they might go locally extinct if that were to happen. So this year, these guys were not as abundant as they normally are, because my guess is the dryness signaled to them not to emerge. Wait for things to improve. This is one of those day-flying moths that looks a lot like a wasp. The family Ceciidae are called the clear-wing moths because, as you can see, especially on the hind wing, so you got the forewing is up here, here's the hind wing. Most of the hind wing doesn't have scales on it anymore, and these things fly around just fine. The forewing has a little bit more scaling on it, but not all that much. And so these tend to be very good wasp or bee mimics, which is a pretty nice little trick because a lot of things learn quickly, a lot of predators learn quickly that going after a wasp or a bee may be a painful experience, and you remember those painful lessons. So this thing will be out there during the daytime, flying around, visiting flowers, acting just like a wasp, looking just like a wasp. They even buzz sometimes when they fly, so they buzz like wasps. And they could do no more to you than any other moth. They're completely harmless, but the similarity is close enough as even if you know it's a moth, at least my brain's saying, don't grab it, you're going to get stung. But you're like, I know, my eyes can tell this is not a wasp. But it's such a deep-seated, instinctual almost reaction that you don't want to touch them. So, like I said, this is a group of day-flying moths. Some of them, many of them feed on members of the squash family as caterpillars, and some of them can become occasional pests. In economic entomology, which is basically related to agricultural crops or forestry, they did a lot of studies on these moths because things like squash crops and pumpkin crops and things were getting hammered by them, and they were able to synthesize the pheromones that the females use to attract males. And that's typically what happens in moths. The females will call, quote unquote call, and by that they're emitting the pheromones. The males use those big antennae to find the females, they mate, and then the eggs are laid. And some of these clear wings were thought to be exceedingly rare because they usually don't show up at lights. They are sometimes seen visiting flowers during the daytime, but some of them are rarely seen. And then they synthesized the pheromones, and they turned out that some of these things are actually quite common. It's just that the way we typically look for them or find them doesn't work for this particular group. So that's a good example of being elusive doesn't necessarily mean that they're rare. And this species falls into that group. It's not very well known at all, but it's a day-flying moth. This was up in the Catalinas a couple of years ago before the fire. So those were all the microlepidoptera. The macros tend to be bigger is the key part. And they're more recent. They're near the bottom of that page, both of those sort of family trees that I showed. It includes the two largest families in the order, the inchworm moths, the geometers, or geos for short, and then the noctuids. And the Noctuidae used to be one huge family. It's since been split into 4 or 5 smaller families, but this is that really thick group at the very bottom is the Noctuids. They tend to be more conservative in their lifestyle, so a lot of that variation, like with things that feed on dried stored food items, woolens, fungus, those tend to be more of the micros. Macros tend to be feeding mostly on foliage or buds perhaps, or fruit. Some of them, there are some that do feed on fungus as well, but their lifestyle is not as diverse overall as it is in the microlepidoptera, but it is much more diverse in species numbers, mainly because of these two families right here. So this is a really cool moth. I love these fancy little plumes down here. This thing is about 3/4 of an inch from wingtip to wingtip. It belongs to a group called the Paralidae, which used to be considered micros, but now they're considered to be macros. Everything is changing in the world of taxonomy, which is biological classification, largely because of DNA analysis. But this guy will regularly come to lights, and they're really easy to identify because they're basically translucent whitish wings with a dark border, and then these are called hair pencils. sticking out of the abdomen. These are also used for calling. In some cases, the males also produce pheromones, and so oftentimes when the female will call, when the male gets close, then he will emit his pheromones, and that just basically is believed to say, okay, you are the right species because I recognize that scent. Tolipes are really sort of cool. They're very hairy moths. They're kind of lazy. They'll fly into a light and they'll stay there sometimes for a day or two. They got these big white hairy legs. They stick out in front of them. They got this dark bluish black mohawk. These things are on the wing. We usually see them. The first one I saw this year was at the end of February. They seem to have 2 generations per year, one like from February to April, and then those offspring are feeding as caterpillars, and then you get a second generation during the monsoon season. And they're basically gray, black, and white, but there's something about the color scheme on this group that I think they really wear gray, black, and white well. And these are the veins. I mentioned the veins earlier as a characteristic that used to be used a lot for recognizing different species and different families. These white lines are the veins. Now, they're not like our veins in the sense that our veins have fluid in them all the time. Basically, in the wings of insects, the fluid is pumped in from the thorax to allow those wings to expand and unfurl. And once they're ready for flight, then the fluid starts to get drawn back into the body. So that by the time the adult might be 2 or 3 weeks old, those are basically hollow struts that are used for support of the wing membrane. So this is one you could show up at your light. It has fairly short wings though, because you can see the abdomen sticking out here past the tip of the wings. The Sphinx moths are sort of popular just because they're fairly good size. Some of them fly during the daytime. They're also called hawk moths. Some of them are called hummingbird moths. These are quite easy moths to attract. If you have a butterfly garden, or if you want to plant a butterfly garden, you will likely get some of the Sphinx moths as well, because many of the plants that attract butterflies during the day will also attract moths at night. So this one's really easy to identify. It's the only Sphinx moth in North America with pink, both on the base of the hind wings right here and on the abdomen. So here's the forewing. You can see the line between the 2 wings is right here. So forewing and then hind wing. So this is a very easy one to recognize. Wingspan on this guy is probably about 3 inches, maybe even a little bit bigger than that from when they have the wings completely spread out. That's another thing a lot of people like about Sphinx moths is they're big, relatively large in size. Rustic Sphinx, this is usually a pretty common one in southern Arizona. It's about the same size as the previous one, sort of black and dark gray with these big white blotchy marks on it. This thing is one that will, again, in a typical year, will readily come to lights. Didn't see as many of these this year either that I normally see, but it's a pretty easy one to identify. Another thing the Sphinx moths have, a trait that they share, is their body's robust, and it kind of tapers to a point. And that's a pretty useful, if you're trying to decide what family you're looking at, which is actually a very good starting point when it comes to trying to identify these things. That long tapering abdomen and the long, relatively skinny forewings, those are 2 useful characters. Also, if you see one humming or hovering in front of a flower with a really long tongue sticking out, that's a pretty good chance it's also a Sphinx moth. There's Sphinx moths that live in Florida and live in the tropics that have a tongue longer than their bodies. And that's very good adaptation to reach into really deep flowers like certain orchids. The big poplar Sphinx. Now this thing is even bigger. It's got a wingspan more of like 4.5 inches. And so this was in Madera Canyon in the Santa Rita Mountains. And so this is your sheet. And basically you have a black light hanging in front of the sheet. And the moths are attracted to the light. And then they come in and the sheet gives them essentially some place to land. And when something like this shows up, the whole sheet moves. It's almost like the wind is blowing. And if you're a mother, that's kind of exciting because you know something big has shown up on the other side if you're on the opposite side of it. So these will feed on, in our area, they're feeding mostly on cottonwoods as caterpillars. So another trick, if you want to find certain moths, find out what their caterpillars eat. find out when their flight season is, when the adults are out flying around, and then go out and find that plant. Because most of these insects are very closely tied to whatever their larvae feed upon. So if you find the plant, assuming they feed on plants, because remember some of these guys don't feed on plants, but if you find some that, find one that feeds on plants, find that plant at the right time of year, you'll likely find the moths around. Same holds true of butterflies, by the way. White line sphinx. This is one I'd venture to guess you've probably seen before. This is without a doubt the most common sphinx moth in southern Arizona and one of the most widespread in North America. This was again up in Garden Canyon, obviously coming to a thistle flower during the daytime, hovering in front. You can see the proboscis is right here. It's going a little darker than the rest, going down into the nectaries of the thistle plant. The white lines come from these white sort of stripes, thin stripes on the wings. They have a pink and black hind wing. And again, you can see how the body tapers to a point. So if you've ever seen a sphinx moth at all before, anywhere in the U.S., there's a pretty good chance it could have been this one. But others can be quite common as well. Like I said, the rustic sphinx, which was 2 slides ago, that's also a fairly common one. The Carolina sphinx, there's a bunch of common ones. But this one seems to be the most abundant, at least in our area. Then we get to the wild silk moths or saturniids. These are sort of the rock stars, I think. Well, one of the rock stars of the moth world, because they tend to be really, pretty spectacular. They tend to be large compared to the average moth. They tend to be interestingly colored or patterned. And so this one, this was actually the same night that big poplar sphinx showed up. This guy showed up. And there, if you're from back east, there's a very, very similar species that lives in the eastern half of North America called the imperial moth, Eocles imperialis. And they're basically eastern and western versions of the same thing. And we get that again with birds like northern flicker, the yellow-shafted form to the east, and the red-shafted form to the west, the eastern screech owl, western screech owl. The same thing often happens with insects as well. What's really fascinating to me about the saturniids is they do not have mouth parts as adults. So, and they're our biggest moth. The biggest moths we have are in this family. So no matter how hungry they get, they can't do anything about it. So that means a couple of things. Number one, their energy for adulthood is provided by that carried over from the larval stage. And number two, they don't live very long. About a week or 10 days or so is the adult lifespan. And that's because they have no way to replenish the energy reserves that they're expending by flying around. So a really good way to, a tried and true way to get these guys is to raise them from from eggs and caterpillars. And then you can put like a female out in, as she's emerging, put her outside in a cage. And then all the moths, all the males that are within calling distance will come in. It's kind of spectacular how far away they'll come. There was a study done in Asia that had a gentleman had a female of a certain species, and he kept going further and further away and releasing different males to see how far back they would come. And one male came from 7 miles away to that female. Usually it's more like a half to maybe a mile, mile and a half, like that, but they can come quite a long ways to find their potential mates. Here's another one. There's another moth, again, eastern and western versions. There's the Polyphemus moth, Antheraea polyphemus. Looks a lot like this one. It tends to be a brighter, sort of almost yellowish brown. This one's darker overall, mainly because there's a lot of black scaling on the wings. But this, you can see the feathery antennae, so this is the male. If you look just at the hind wings, it looks kind of like 2 eyes and a mustache. This wingspan is probably closer to 4.5, 5 inches. This is definitely a sheet rattler. When they fly in, the whole sheet moves. Some of these saturniids are sort of late risers, so not all moths start to become active right after dark. Some of them do, some of them are active, within a couple hours. These guys are typically early in the morning, like after midnight, between like midnight and 5 a.m. oftentimes. So This one we got lucky. This is more like 10:30, 11 o'clock, kind of an early riser for their group. But they don't, like I said, they don't all emerge at once and start flying around. They have sort of their own schedules. So the Hubbard small silk moth, this is that one that I said that will feed on mesquite and just go out there with a flashlight. This is what that caterpillar will turn into. And they're small only relative to some of the other silk moths. So the two previous slides, again, with wingspans of anywhere from 3 to 4.5 inches. This has a wingspan more of like 2.5 inches. So for a moth, for a silk moth, it's not huge, but compared to a lot of other moths, it's still pretty big. They'll typically rest with their wings. So again, the forewings are sort of black with these dark markings, a white spot. They usually rest with their wings shut, so you can't see this pinkish red. And it's believed that that is by design, such that if a predator were to come up, it can open its wings, and this sudden appearance of this reddish coloration might startle it and give the moth a chance to fly away, perhaps. But these guys, this is the one, this time of year, if you went out in your backyard with a flashlight in the evening and focus on mostly mesquite trees, but potentially acacias or things, other legumes if you have them in your yard. I don't see them very often on Palo Verde, but if you have any of the acacias like catclaw acacia, whitethorn acacia, as well as mesquite, you go out with a flashlight and you might see the caterpillars. Again, not a great year for them in terms of numbers. So then we get to the geometers. These are the inchworm moths, and they're called inchworm moths because on the earlier slide I showed you those several pair of those fleshy legs called prolegs, and those help caterpillars walk. The inchworm caterpillars are missing 2 or 3 pairs of those, and so that means they have to reach forward with their body and then bring their rear end to them, and that forms a loop. So another thing is they're called loopworms or loopers. And so if you see a caterpillar walking if you're lucky enough to find them, because their caterpillars are very well camouflaged, they look like sticks or bits of bark or something. If you're lucky enough to find them, their manner of walking, there are a couple lineages in the Noctuidae that do the same thing, but most of them are going to be geometers, and the adults are very well camouflaged as well. So they'll land like on a rock wall perhaps, or a tree trunk, and they just blend in remarkably well. But Iridopsis is one of the more common geos we have in the desert valleys, and they can vary a lot. This is a fairly pale one. They can be much darker than this, and then that adds some of the just like red-tailed hawks are quite variable, some of the moths are quite variable as well in their coloration. Here's another one. If you see a green moth on at your light, it's going to be one of the what are called emeralds, which are in the geometer. This guy's wingspan is probably half an inch. So these are smaller than some of the micros that are out there, but they're also quite distinctive. Some of them are kind of, this is a pale pastel green. Some of them are a richer green color. But if you see a small green moth, it's going to be very likely it's going to be one of this group. And we have 3 different genera in Arizona that match that. So here, this is another day-flying moth. It's a geometer. You can see the feathery antennae on this guy. This is a rabbit brush, which is a sort of a grassland shrub. It's a great nectar source, like late October into November. Anything that feeds on nectar that's still around at that time of year is going to be at these flowers, because it's sort of like the last great food source before the weather starts to turn colder for the rest of the year. I wanted to include this guy because this is a pretty rare moth. In fact, there aren't many records of this. And so I had taken a group out to look at butterflies at the rabbit brush south of Patagonia last year or the year before. I can't remember exactly when it was. And this thing was here. And I sent a photo to a friend of mine because I had never seen it before. And I'm like, I know it's a moth, but it looks, the wing shape is sort of geometer-like. And he said, yeah, that's a pretty rare species in Arizona. So they have these velvety black wings with white wingtips and sort of orange on the head and thorax. So again, not all moths fly during the daytime. The noctuids, this is that really huge group. This thing is a common one. Usually rests with the wings shut, so you don't see the orange, but its caterpillars feed on the stems of cholla cacti. So if you have cholla in your neighborhood, you probably have these moths around as well. This one, if you've ever been up in the Huachucas, or any of the Skyland ranges for that matter, in southern Arizona during the monsoon season, this is one of the more common day-flying moths you can encounter. This was in Garden Canyon at a place where there was a puddle and a car had driven through and sort of washed the waves up onto the dirt. And so a lot of moths and butterflies will do this, and they're using it to soak up salts that have been dissolved by the water. And so I didn't spend much time in the Huachucas during the monsoon this year. Last year, if you'd walked 100 yards, you probably would have seen hundreds of them. They were extraordinarily common. But again, a day-flying moth, and then it got the thread-like antenna sticking out, not the feathery ones, and not the club at the tip. This is a cool one. This is, I mean, just the fact that it's kind of pinkish red streaks on a white moth is pretty cool. This is not, I mean, it's not super common, meaning if you turn your patio lights on, you don't get hundreds of them, but you might get 3 or 4, or maybe, you know, if you're lucky at, 10 or so during the flight season, which again is the monsoon. The monsoon season is typically the best time of year, not only for moths, but insects in general. But it's also dependent, as was exhibited this year, it's depending not only on the time of year, but also how good the monsoon is. And this year was obviously not a very good monsoon, so the moth numbers were down. So, but that, I mean, there were still moths out there, just not in the numbers we would see in a wetter year. So then we're starting to get into, so this is one of the tiger moths I mentioned. Again, you can see a lot of the scales are off the wings. This is a different family down here. So this one, the spotted Abaddalotes, has a wingspan of probably close to 2 inches. Edwards glassy wing, it's a little bit bigger than that. But both, shows you what you can get at a light. This one you've probably all seen before. It's another very common day-flying moth. They also sometimes come to lights at night, but I typically see them during the daytime. So if you go to look at the rabbit brush here in a few weeks, you'll see these guys there for sure. They get this name because the orangey streaks kind of are on the veins of the wings, and they're very, they have a sort of a bluish, iridescent blue thorax and an orange head. This is pronounced Tanuka, by the way. That C is silent, so I don't even know why it's in there. But this is one of those moths, common daytime at flowers. You can also see them at mud. You can also see them in small numbers coming to your lights at night. I don't know when they sleep because they seem like they're active all the time. But a member of the tiger moth group, as is this one. This one is just, I don't know, to me this is a very elegant moth. To give you a frame of reference, this thing is probably 1.5 inches long. Oops, let me go back. 1.5 inches long from the top to the bottom. There are several different tiger moths that are predominantly white in color, like the salt marsh tiger moth, which despite its name, we get very commonly in southern Arizona. But this one with the buffy tinges to the head and to the thorax there are pretty snazzy, I think. Another wasp mimic. I've only seen this thing a couple of times. This one was down at Peña Blanca Lake, northwest of Nogales. If you've ever been out to the five-striped sparrow spot in California Gulch, you may have gone near this location. But again, it's a wasp mimic. It just so happened that this particular individual showed up at a black light, and why that's a little bit unusual is most wasps are active during the daytime. So if you're trying to avoid predators, it tends to be better to be active when your model is also active. So this one just happened to come into a light. This one is a really cool tiger moth, I think. This is fairly common up in our mountains. The white wings with the gray blotches surrounded by black, and then the orange or red and black hind wings is really kind of spectacular. This is the same moth that was on the title slide. This one just has its wings open. You may never have heard of tiger moths, but you're very likely familiar with at least one species, or at least its caterpillar. The woolly bear, the famous woolly bear, said to be able to predict the severity of the winter, which it cannot do. is one of the tiger moths. And many of the caterpillars in this family look like that, sort of bristly, but they can't sting. They can be toxic, so I wouldn't try to eat one. But they have a very pretty characteristic look to them, with those sort of, not really hairs, more like stiff, like toothbrush bristles on them. And then this one is just spectacular. This guy's a wingspan of more like 3 inches. It's the largest tiger moth in North America. This one is a male because it's got the mostly white hind wings. Females replace the white with this orangey color and are even more spectacular. I have no idea where the flag moth part of the name comes from, but this is, so, you know, southern Arizona, the Huachucas, especially the Chiricahuas, the Santa Ritas, well, those have been famous with birders for quite some time. Those same mountain ranges have been equally famous with entomologists for probably about the same amount of time. And if you look in sort of some of the scientific literature, you'll find that a lot of these moths were first detected in those mountain ranges in the US. And so just like birders come from all over the world to southeastern Arizona to look at the birds, the same happens with moths. And as I said, during the monsoon season, you get, that's the peak of activity. That's when a lot of these species are on the wing. And you'll go to places like the Huachucas, or you go to the Madera Canyon, you'll see what looks like a really bizarre carnival, because you have all these black lights or mercury vapor lights set up in the woods. And that's because people have come here for the moths and or the beetles, because that's a great time for scarab beetles and longhorn beetles and things as well. And so it's this, and you'll be sitting out there and you're getting serenaded by the owls and the whippoorwills and the porwills, and it's really fantastic. And then all of a sudden you see the headlamp walking towards you, and I'm so-and-so from San Diego. What are you having at your sheet? And it's really kind of a really sort of cool community. Some admittedly might think it's a bit odd, but I'm used to, I go around with a flashlight at night in my backyard, and I set up black lights in my backyard. So I'm pretty sure my neighbors already think I'm a little bit off a bit, but that's okay. Let them think that. But you know, that's the way you can find this really, the thing I like about moths is not only the diversity out there, but many of them are common, but they're just active when we are not. So it requires a little bit of effort on our part. So there's sort of this diversity that's going on, you know, each night, but we're inside watching Netflix or whatever, and we're not, you know, able to really get appreciation for that. So a really easy thing you can do, just turn on a patio light and see what shows up. But anyway, that was the last slide. I will go and unshare my screen. And so this is a really, moths are really cool. I admire, one day I want to get to the UK during the summer and just hang out with the UK mothers, because they are a phenomenal group. They know their fauna so much better than we even know, like in Arizona, never mind all of North America. But they're pretty fantastic. And so I actually have three field guides for the moths of the UK, and very few of them, very few of them also occur in Arizona, but they do such a good job of knowing their moths that they kind of inspired me to try to get a better handle on what we have. So yeah, there's a lot of moths out there. New species are being described all the time, even from the US. In fact, I can think of a couple, 2 or 3 macros, and probably a dozen or more micros that have been described just from Arizona in the last probably 2 years. So we're still trying to identify all the ones that are out there. So that, you know, that's moths. Get moth fever, catch it, is what I would say. But the one thing that's really cool is it's passed for this year, but next year in mid-July, the dates are already out. I just can't remember what they are. There's this thing called National Moth Week, and it's basically a bunch of people going out and looking at moths. And so you can go to nationalmothweek.org and find out the events, you know, that are going to happen, as well as the dates. And it's called National Moth Week, but it's gone global. It's all over the world now. So it's really kind of cool. And I think, spending a night looking at moths is not a bad way to spend an evening. Even it's one of those things that a bad night at a moth sheet is a lot better than a lot of other nights could be. So, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you can sort of appreciate these guys a little bit more. They're not out trying to eat up all of our crops or our sweaters. They have a lot going on. So hope you liked it. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. And if I don't know the answer, I'll just make something up.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was absolutely fantastic.
Thank
I have
you.
to say, I've been a little bit unsure about Moths ever since I saw Silence of the Lambs, because the villain in that used to put the pupae of the death's-head hawk moth down the throats of his victims, and my goodness.
Yes, that set mothers back a few decades, I think. Sure.
But tell me, I think I'm right in saying that the death's-head hawk moth is actually a moth which vocalizes.
It does.
It makes a little chirp.
Yeah.
So, have you ever heard a moth?
I've not, because they are basically at a lower, their frequency range, I can't hear very well to begin with, and their frequency range is, you often need special instruments to hear them. I've heard recordings of like tiger moths, so the bats are out there echolocating. Tiger moths, money moths actually have ears. They can be on the thorax or they can be on the abdomen. So they hear these sounds, and the tiger moths will actually emit this burst of sound that is, some tiger moths do, that will jam the sonar of the bats. And so I've heard recordings of that, but I've never actually heard one. It's almost like it's, at least on tiger moths, it's almost like it strikes me as kind of like a horn blaring. It's like a really, it's a very simple sound, but it's very high volume, and it's sort of to get the, it's just a frequency range we don't hear very well, but I'm sure it gets the bats' attention very well.
Great. Okay, we have a question coming. Yeah, we have a question coming in from Pam Kraski. So, can you open up the microphone? Let Pam ask her question.
Hey, Pam.
Okay. No, I heard that they were using moth cells in cancer research, and I wondered if you knew anything more about that.
They've used, they have used some of them. I know I'm not real familiar with what they're using them with cancer research. I know that the Carolina sphinx moth, its caterpillars, which are actually the whole life cycle, Manduca sexta, that's the scientific name. That's been used in biomedical and genetic research for decades. So the fact that it could be related to that, but it could be other species of moths are also being investigated. The tricky part for biomedical researchers is there's so many different forms of life on this planet, and there's only so much time and money that they have to invest in their research that who knows, one of these moths might have the cure of cancer hidden in its cells, and that just no one's looked at it. And the fact that there's so many moths would sort of indicate that may never, we're still identifying new species. We're not looking much at how each of those species lives its life and how its physiology works and how those sorts of more intricate and subtle processes happen. So I think it's a matter of there's a lot of opportunity out there potentially. It's just a matter of where the funding is going to come from. But specifically with cancer research, I'm not sure what species and what they're looking at. But the fact that someone has decided to look at moths in that regard does not surprise me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Magical and mysterious, Jeff. You didn't mention the Black Witch.
The Black Witch, yes. Which is a huge failing on my part, because the Black Witch is like the coolest thing ever. First of all, it's the Black Witch, right? It's got a cool name, even though it's mostly brown. We're not going to let, as you know from the bird world, we have a lot of issues with common names. So the black witch is really brown, but it's this huge thing. It's actually got a wingspan of probably 5, maybe even 6 inches. It's a tropical moth, and it comes up from Mexico. It comes up. It can start in the spring. The numbers kind of build up during the monsoon season. And this year there were some of them around, especially early in the season. I saw a lot of people sending, asking me, sending me photographs. And there's a Southwestern Moths Facebook page. A lot of photos were posted on there, and then things just kind of stopped. And I think it's because of the weather we had this year. But yeah, they're fantastic. When I used to live in the Bahamas, and there are resident species down there, and we'd be sitting, we had this little cottage we lived in, and they were so big that you can hear them when they hit the window screen. It's like you have your light on, they go, you hear a soft thud, and it's like, oh, the black witches are out there. Yeah, they're phenomenal. Here's the thing: when you have 2,000 species in southeastern Arizona, it's kind of, the editorial process is harsh. And so if we ever do this again, I will include the black witch, because they're just phenomenal.
Yeah, the first one we saw, we thought it was like a small bat flying around.
Correct. In fact, they're about the size of like our smallest bats. They're fantastic.
We have a question from Glenn.
Okay, a question from Glenn.
One moment.
We're just unmuting you.
There you go, Glenn.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi.
Hi, Glenn.
The question is surrounding moth scales. I've heard they're harmful to the body, whether it be by allergy, I don't know, or just an irritant. And secondly, if you can compare scales to butterflies, if you touch a butterfly, you get like a powder off their wing. Is there any comparison or contrast you can make?
Yeah, so the first question, some of them, first of all, thank you very much for attending, Glenn. Nice to see you again. It's been a while. So a handful of species do have, it's not really the scales on the wings, it's the scales that kind of look like hairs that can be an irritant. And so there's an introduced species that seems to be most common like in northeastern North America, especially the Cape Cod area, called the brown-tail moth. And when the females lay their eggs, they wrap some of those hair-like scales around them because they are an irritant. However, most moths that's not the case. So the vast majority of moths don't produce scales that are irritating, and those few that do, it's those hair-like scales. It's not the scales on the wings. And then as far as the little dust-like stuff on your fingertips, it's exactly the same in butterflies and moths. If there's scales on the wings and you touch the butterfly or the moth, even no matter how gentle you are, a few of those will wear off and they're left on your fingertips. It's the same in both groups. There's really no difference in that regard. And like I said, they hypothesize that they evolved that to be able to get out of spider webs, actually, that they might leave some scales behind, but the insect as a whole would be able to fly away. Plus, obviously, over time, they've used them for camouflage and things of that nature as well. But most butterfly and moth scales are very similar, and only a small number of species produce the irritants.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Glenn.
Okay, Jeff. Well, I don't think we have any more questions for now.
Okay.
So just want to mention to everyone that we have recorded this fantastic talk that Jeff gave, and this will be made available on the Southwest Wings website, which is swwings.org, and it'll be there for 30 days now. So you can listen again, or if you know friends who wanted to listen and couldn't, then they will be able to by going to the website. Also, to let you know that on the 28th of next month, October, will be our next webinar, and that will be Ken Blankenship and Ali Forsberg talking about the little brown jobs of Southeast Arizona. And that's looking mainly at sparrows and habitats.
You don't say
Not
it.
necessarily the identification, but just kind of why they're here, what are they doing here, and a lot of interesting facts about them. So I'm looking forward to that very much. The sparrows have started to arrive here. We've got a nice little group of white-crowned sparrows now, a few Lincoln sparrows in our yard. So the numbers are starting to grow. By a month's time, it's going to be great to learn more about our sparrows.
And Ken and Allie will do a great job. I am absolutely positive of that.
Yeah, great.
Oh, yeah, they're great. Yeah.
So Jeff, once again, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Glenn.
Fascinating talk. I've learned a huge
Good
amount,
job.
and I'm sure everyone has.
Yeah, well, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure, and let's keep our fingers crossed that next year we can actually set up a sheet somewhere and let the moths kind of sell themselves.
I
That's
want to
right.
spend a night with you next year, Jeff.
You got it. Sounds like a plan.
Good.
All right, thank you guys very much. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for coming, everybody. Take
Bye-bye.
care. Stay well. See you next month.